Chapter 8. The Test, Part 2. Hinata raced through the woods, heading towards where Naruto had impacted. She had found him easily enough with her Byakugan, but Kakashi-sensei had really sent him flying. It took her at least 7 minutes to reach Naruto's location, and she didn't like what she saw when she arrived. Naruto had apparently crashed head first through a thick branch and was now passed out on the forest floor. On his way down, the branches had torn up his face, and now it was covered in some nasty scratches. She turned him over and carefully dragged him so that he was leaning against a tree. She didn't know what caused him to vomit so intensely after that technique, but she didn't want him choking if he had a repeat episode. She reached into her pouch and took out her special ointment that she had made herself and started working on fixing his cuts. As she worked on the blonde, dabbing the cream on his scratches, Kakashi couldn't help but be impressed. He stalked the pair from the treetops as his clone finished up with Sasuke. He couldn't help but be surprised by her medical knowledge. He was pleased to note that all traces of her shyness seemed to evaporate as she worked. She reminded him of a doctor working in an operating room. No emotions clouding your judgment and just focusing on your goal. Time to see if those Hyuga eyes were as good at detecting genjutsu as the clan claimed. Kakashi began to cast a light genjutsu with the intention of making it seem like Naruto's state was deteriorating. But the moment the jutsu started to seep into her system, she whipped around and noticed him immediately. Even without the Byakugan active, she still saw right through his genjutsu. He cut the jutsu short and just stared back at the girl. Now that took some serious chakra control and mental discipline. He was actually starting to like this girl. He dropped to the ground in front of them as Hinata took up a defensive stance over Naruto. That's some very efficient cream. Those scratches already look like they're healing. Any chance you're willing to tell me where you got it? I made it myself from herbs found within the Hyuga estate. Kakashi noted how her stance did not waver, despite her cordial tone. Really? Very impressive. Now then, what are you going to do? There isn't much time left, and you're the only one who hasn't attempted to obtain the bells. She bit her lip as she glanced between the Jonin and the boy behind her. There was no way she was going to be able to protect him as well as try to get the bells. She was no fool. She knew she had no chance by herself. She needed help. She quickly flung a kunai at Kakashi before slamming a smoke grenade into the ground. He didn't even move his feet as he batted the kunai away, keeping his eye on the smoke. After the cloud settled, he wasn't too surprised that Hinata and Naruto were gone. At least she understood the point of the exercise, Kakashi thought to himself. But that isn't enough. All 3 of them have to work together if they want to succeed. Hinata raced towards Sasuke's chakra with Naruto's limp form on her back. With Naruto out cold, she was going to need the Uchiha's help if any of them were going to pass. As she entered the clearing, she was startled to find Sasuke's head sticking out of the ground. He shot her a glare as a blush erupted across his cheeks. Not a word. He muttered, clearly embarrassed by his helpless situation. She gave him a nod and carefully set Naruto before helping him dig himself out. Around this time, Naruto was finally beginning to stir, and when he did, he was met with a massive headache. Ugh, what hit me? He said as he tried to regain his bearings. His eyes were blurry, and he blinked a few times before his vision finally came back into focus on the side of Sasuke's head. He took one look before bursting out laughing and falling on his back. Sasuke's face burned crimson in anger and embarrassment. Shut up, dumbass! Oh my lord, this is priceless! The blonde rolled on the ground, clutching his sides, as Sasuke finally climbed free from his trap. He gave Hinata a thankful nod as he began brushing off his clothes. Excuse me, you two, Hinata interjected. She felt her face heating up as both boys turned their attention onto her. Why had this been so much easier a minute ago? I don't think any of us are going to be able to take a bell from Kakashi-sensei on our own. Speak for yourself, the Uchiha cut in. I'm going off to find that man and take that bell. Hey! Naruto yelled, grabbing the retreating boy's shoulder, forcing him to face him. That was rude. Apologize to Hinata. Let go of me. I don't want either of your help, nor do I need it. You can't do everything yourself, you jackass. Stop being so stubborn and just hear her out. And I just said I don't want your help. Why, you little... Their argument was broken off as the sound of the alarm clock pierced across the training grounds. Time was up. Oh, Hinata. A familiar voice called sweetly from a tree near the training posts. Looking up, the genin saw their sensei lazily leaning against the tree trunk. Yes, sensei? She muttered nervously. She did not like where this was going. Did you try to get a bell? He asked far too casually. Hinata took a step back. No, sensei. Well, you know what that means, right? Hinata could only hang her head in shame as she accepted her fate. Kakashi had been more than a little disappointed by the results. There was no denying that these kids were talented. Skill-wise, they earned their genin ranking with flying colors, and maybe could even put a few chunin to shame. As he went over the concept of the survival exercise, he couldn't help but notice the feelings of guilt that spread across the boys' faces. If they had tried together to get the bells, he was certain that they at least would be able to get one of them. Alright, I'm gonna give you guys one last chance. He left clear instructions to not feed Hinata for her failure to even attempt to obtain a bell, before disappearing with a shunshin. He now watched the pair eating quietly as the young girl's stomach growled, causing her to turn red in embarrassment. As if planned together, both boys offered their lunches at once. The three genin stared at each other in shock before Hinata shook her head. Please, don't waste your opportunity on me. Too bad, Hinata. I have to make it up to you for patching me up after I landed on my head. I also owe you an apology, Sasuke said as he offered her his food. You're the only one who saw the true meaning of this test. With all of us at our full strength, I'm confident we can get the bells from Kakashi. The blonde vigorously nodded his head in agreement as tears threatened to fall down the young girl's face. Kakashi smiled behind his mask. They finally got it. Come on, sensei, let us go! Naruto yelled as he struggled against the rope. Sorry. You and Sasuke admitted yourselves that Hinata was the only one who saw through the true meaning of the test, meaning that you two are the ones who failed. If you want to get free, do it yourself. The blonde and black-haired boys were now tied up against the training posts as Hinata and Kakashi stood over them. Alright then, we'll meet back here tomorrow for our first day of real training. As he turned to leave, he gave one last look to Hinata. I know I just gave that whole speech about abandoning comrades, but try to overlook that right now. Don't help them to get free. They'll never learn if you keep picking up the slack. She blushed at the compliment as the Jonin disappeared in a swirl of leaves. Hinata turned and bowed to the two boys with a light smile on her face. Gomen, Naruto, Sasuke. But it appears I am less than trash. With that, she turned and left, barely controlling her giggling. Hinata! Please, don't leave! It was another grueling 15 minutes before Sasuke finally freed himself from his bindings. Great job, Sasuke! Now let me out! The blonde pleaded. Sasuke smirked and dropped his kunai just out of reach of Naruto's feet. A good shinobi should be able to escape from this himself. He strolled away as the blonde yelled at him with a plethora of curses. After a painstaking hour, Naruto was finally able to wriggle a kunai out of his pouch and cut himself free. Yatta! He shouted to the air. He was about to head home when he remembered he was about to forget something. He froze at the realization and frantically started searching the field, wondering where he could have dropped it. Panic was starting to overtake him when a cool voice behind him called out, "Looking for this?" He spun around to find Kakashi dangling his special kunai from his finger. Naruto couldn't help but let out a sigh of relief. Thank you, Kakashi-sensei. I don't know what I would have done if I lost that. He reached out for it, but was surprised when Kakashi pulled it away. I'm happy to return this back to you, but I have a couple of questions I'd like answered first, Kakashi said in a more serious tone. After he was sure the blonde understood, he continued. First off, let's start with the easier option. I assume Kitsune, was the one who taught you that Katon jutsu? The boy was quiet as he nodded vigorously, anxious to get his kunai back. I want to make sure that he fully explained how dangerous that jutsu can be. As Naruto tilted his head to the side, it was evident the blonde didn't know what he was talking about. I'm sure Kitsune has told you, there are multiple steps to that jutsu, correct? Another nod. Good. I'm sure that he was going to fully explain it to you. But you are now my soldier, and I want to make sure you know how dangerous that jutsu can be. He brought up his other hand and raised one finger. That technique is Kitsune's signature jutsu, as well as one of his most deadly. The jutsu has 3 stages, each more dangerous than the last. The first is the one you have down, which acts almost like a simple flamethrower Katon jutsu. It supplies a steady stream of fire, which takes on a yellow hue. What makes this jutsu special is that the flames linger as long as the caster is conscious. Only he can dispel the flames. He raised his second finger as he continued. The next stage is about increasing the heat and intensity of the jutsu. The jutsu changes from crimson to a pure white as the heat increases dramatically. At this stage, the flames would be hot enough to melt steel. What makes it special is, like the previous stage, they keep their intense heat even after the technique has ended. The flames only disappear when the caster wants them to. The boy seemed excited as he lifted his third finger. Finally, the third stage, which is the most deadly of them all. This stage is why I am making sure you understand how dangerous that jutsu can be. The heat is turned up even more at this stage, turning the flames solid blue. What is incredibly deadly is what happens when the flames come into contact with something. While the first stage is about forming the shape, and the second is about increasing the intensity, the third step is about changing the composition of the jutsu. I don't know the full details, but I do know that anything the flame touches practically liquefies on contact. The boy's eyes were wide in excitement at this. This can go for anything. Steel walls, masonry. He shot him a glare with his visible eye. People. The boy gulped as the realization hit him. He had a jutsu that could do that on Kakashi-sensei. Thankfully, I am a jonin, and that was only the first level of the technique. But imagine if you had tried to use that on someone who wasn't able to invade in time. Even if you were using the lower level of that jutsu, imagine hitting one of your teammates. You'd be panicking, making it harder for you to correctly form your chakra to dispel the jutsu. He didn't have to say it, but he could tell the boy got the message. Be careful and don't use it in a spar against his teammates. Now, moving on. The most prevalent question on my mind is this. Once again, he held up the kunai. Where did you find this? Naruto gulped as he answered. I found it out in the woods around here a couple years ago. I saw the seal formula and I just couldn't help myself. I've been working on it ever since. Kakashi could not hide his shock. Are you saying that you learned the Hiraishin all by yourself? The boy ate up the man's surprise. He puffed out his chest and said, You bet your ass I did. Although, there are still those drawbacks, he thought to himself with a wince. Kakashi was silent for a moment. Well, isn't that something else? Finally, he tossed the kunai back to the boy, who felt relief flood through his body as his prized possession came back to where it belonged. His quick relief quickly turned to shock as he watched Kakashi reach into his own pouch and pulled out an identical kunai to the one in his hands. The boy's head swiveled back and forth between the two, as if he couldn't comprehend what he was seeing. Where did you get that? Naruto asked with a hint of awe, while his head began to overflow with questions. Were you the one to develop the jutsu? Kakashi laughed as he shook his head. Sorry to burst your bubble, but no. My own sensei was actually the one who had developed the jutsu. He gave me this kunai as a gift the day I became a jonin. I've always kept it with me as a reminder of him. Rubbing the handle one last time, he made up his mind as he offered it to the boy. Take it. It seems like it will do more good with you than with me. Kakashi said, chuckling at Naruto's starstruck expression. Naruto couldn't stop himself from shaking as he slowly took the blade from the older man's hand. Are you sure, Sensei? His voice cracked. He couldn't help but run his fingers along the handle, feeling the grooves of the symbols etched into the wood. Kakashi shrugged. It seems to me that you'll get more out of it than I ever have. Naruto is silent before lunging at the Jonin and wrapping him around in a tight embrace. Kakashi was surprised, but chuckled as he patted the blonde's hair. Thank you. The blonde whispered, almost muffled by the Jonin's flak jacket. Don't mention it. Now, while I'm certainly impressed with how far you've gotten by yourself, I know from first-hand experience that those side effects aren't normal. The blonde slowly removed himself and seemed embarrassed as he wiped his nose before answering. I'm trying to figure that out. The problem is that the effects vary in intensity each time I do it. I tested to see if distance or chakra usage made the reaction worse, but it has never been constant. Kakashi nodded as he began the turn back towards the village. He had a meeting after all. Wait, Kakashi-sensei, the boy pleaded. I have to know. Who was your sensei? Is he someone I'd know? Kakashi chuckled as he glanced back over his shoulder. You might have heard of him. After all, he was the one that placed the seal in your stomach. Kakashi stayed long enough to enjoy the look of wide-eyed realization flash across the boy's face, before he shined away towards the Hokage's office. 2 hours later. This is just getting silly. I don't understand why you allow him to get away with this, Hokage-sama. An irate Kurenai said as she and Asuma stood before the signed daime. Let's just say he's paying his respects to someone in his own special way, the Hokage said coyly. What do you... Kurenai was cut off as a knock at the door signaled that he had finally arrived. Well, look who it is. Asuma said, rolling his eyes as Kakashi sauntered in. Couldn't you have hurried up to tell us that you failed them? You know we can't leave until everyone's reports are in. Kakashi barely paid him any mind as he stood before the professor. I'm happy to report that Team 7 passed with flying colors. Silence settled over the room. Kakashi couldn't help but be amused at the sight of Asuma's cigarette, just barely hanging out of his mouth. Did they now? The Hokage asked with a knowing smile, folding his hands in front of his face. What can I say? The kids have talent. Kakashi replied with a shrug before turning his full attention to the Hokage. I need to speak to you alone. Now. Ignoring the others in the room, he followed up with, without Anbu. Kurenai couldn't help but shoot him a worried look, but obediently turned and left the room after a nod from the Hokage. She and Asuma shot the pair one final glance as they followed the Anbu agents out of the door, which shut behind them with a soft thud. After a moment of silence, Kakashi turned to his right and said, You too, Kitsune. The boy appeared behind the old man's shoulders, his body tense and protective. The Hokage spared him a glance and a knowing look. Reluctantly, the boy stood down and offered one last bow before following the others out of the room. The silence that settled over the room was deafening. It was another minute before Kakashi spoke up again. So, when were you going to tell me that we had another yellow flash on our hands? The old man chuckled as he palmed his pipe and produced a small flame from his finger to light it. I thought it would be entertaining to see your blind reaction. He paused and took a drag of his pipe before continuing. I'm honestly surprised he got a punch in. Kakashi eyed the glass ball behind the old man's desk as he rubbed his jaw. I was surprised myself, though he only landed it because of the shock value and the gravity seal. So, he really did discover it himself? The old man nodded, leaning back in his chair. I was just as surprised as you. It was about 2 years ago. I had known for a while he had been meddling with some secret project for some time. But when he came forward and showed me what it was, I was speechless. It was like watching Minato attempt the technique all over again. He softly smiled as a wave of nostalgia settled over him. He let the feelings reminisce for a few moments longer before his expression took on a more serious look. However, I am concerned about the toll the jutsu is taking on his body. Kakashi nodded as the Hokage took another drag of his pipe. Minato had experienced some disorientation during the early stages of development, but afterwards, his body adjusted to the feeling. The only time he experienced anything similar to what Naruto has felt was the first time he ever attempted it. That was before he adjusted to the Nidame seal, if Tsunade hadn't been present. He was silent as the implication rolled over both of them. The Hokage rose from his chair with a groan and turned to look out of the glass window over the village. "What do you think the issue could be?" Kakashi asked as he walked around the desk and stood next to the older man. "Who knows? We're talking about a situation where a child, a talented child granted, but nevertheless a child, is attempting to recreate an extremely difficult technique that has stumped seal masters for years. It could be anything from the boy simply not performing the jutsu correctly, to something in the seal fighting against him. Since he's come this far, why not let him look over the jutsu source formula?" The thought had crossed my mind, but we were never able to locate a detailed copy of Minato's version of the formula. To be honest, it is likely still locked away in the Namikaze estate. The place is blocked off by powerful blood seals, and Jiraiya refuses to help do anything about them, leaving the only way in to be Naruto. Kakashi finished. "Correct, and that would raise some difficult questions that the boy is not ready for. It is far too early. Besides, he has come this far on his own. Let's see if the boy is able to master it by himself. The more he experiments, the better understanding he will gain from it." The Hokage sighed, then turned his gaze towards the west side of the village. "Now I think we've discussed Naruto enough for one night. I'm curious to hear about your other two students as well." Kakashi closed his visible eye. Sasuke performed just as you'd expect from the Uchiha. Powerful fire techniques and superb taijutsu skills. I'd be willing to say that he is already Chunin rank in skill. But? The Hokage asked with a raised eyebrow. "But he needs to work on social skills. I can already see traces of a severe inferiority and superiority complex in the works. At least he sees his teammates as people he can stand. I intend to keep a close eye on that and make sure it doesn't develop into something ugly." The Hokage nodded. "And what about little Hinata?" Kakashi rubbed his head. "Honestly, I didn't get a good look at Hinata's skill level. I can only assume that she is competent in her clan's taijutsu. She was the only one who saw through the meaning of the test and was preoccupied with aiding her teammates the entire time. I'd appreciate it if you could point me in the direction of some beginner medical jutsu. She has a knack for it. Coupled with her Byakugan, I see quite the surgeon in our future." The Hokage nodded as he soaked this in. "She may end up needing more of your attention than the boys will. She's got a lot of trouble already piled at her feet." Kakashi warily stared at the old man. "As her teacher, you are entitled to certain information. This is a secret to be kept between Hyuga and us. About 2 years ago, there was an incident beneath the clan's library." Said Hyuga unceremoniously flopped onto her bed, exhausted from the day's events. She had just finished talking with her father. His eyes had flashed when he heard the names of her teammates, and she could have sworn she had seen him sharply glance to a photo on his desk. Even after that display, he seemed pleased with the results of her report. Of course, she had left out the part of how she had been tied to the pole. She could only imagine the lecture and shame she would receive if he heard about that. She shifted her head into a more comfortable position, and was met by the small scroll on her nightstand. She glared at the parchment until she noticed something that was different. Just like its inside, the outside had always remained blank. But now, there was a kanji for 1 written in black ink. She nervously took the scroll into her hand. She took a deep breath before slowly opening it. The once blank pages were now partly filled. She gazed across the title that read, "The Tale of the Rabbit Goddess, Part 1. Chapter 9. A Change of Pace. 1 month later. Sasuke was irritated. Granted, this wasn't an unusual thing for him. But today, it was at a boiling point. He had hoped that after leaving the academy, his training would finally start getting serious. Instead, he felt like he was stuck in place, doing nothing to affect his growth. For the past month, all his sensei had taught them was team-building exercises. He didn't need or want the man's sentimental lessons. This, plus the fact they were stuck doing chores every day, was driving him mad. He refused to call them missions. No matter how much Kakashi explained how the D ranks were essential for the village and a rite of passage for Genin, it was still a waste of their time. What bothered him even more was the feeling that he was no longer miles ahead of his teammates. He shot the two a glance. The three of them had settled into this morning routine as they waited for their sensei to eventually show up. Hinata was off to the side, warming up with her Jyoken katas, while the blonde loudmouth sat across from him with his nose stuck behind another one of his books. Even though he held no interest in studying Fuinjutsu, Sasuke couldn't help but feel frustration creep through his body over the boy's proficiency in the art, especially after the blonde's latest news. After years of effort, Naruto had finally arrived at the final book of the Intermediate series. During their missions, he wouldn't stop talking about how excited he was for some sort of test. Apparently, if he passed it, he could finally move on to the Advanced series. Although he could have been more humble about it, Sasuke had indeed earned the right to consider himself the strongest of his age group. That being said, even he wouldn't claim to be any kind of expert in the fields he specialized in. His levels in taijutsu and ninjutsu were certainly above most chunin, but still nowhere close to earning a title of mastery. It was humbling and vexing to admit that he wasn't the only prodigy on the team. The boy had been socially inept and struggled with the simplest of subjects. But somehow, he was at a level of skill that already surpassed the majority of Fuinjutsu users in Konoha. Not that there were many Fuinjutsu users in Konoha, mind you. For how important the art seemed to be, he was surprised when he had found out that they were extremely uncommon. When trying to consider why, he recalled what his mother had once told him about a failed Sealing Corps project. It had been a project created by the Yoindaime as an attempt to revitalize the dying art back to Konoha. In fact, a close friend of Sasuke's mother had apparently been some sort of teacher for this project. However, the project fell apart after the Ninetales attack and the Yoindaime's death. Without teachers, the students apparently struggled to progress any further after they approached the more complicated course load. Yet, here sat the class clown, advancing further than grown adults had managed even with help from a Hokage. Sasuke tried to shove the accomplishments of the irritating blonde out of his mind as his gaze fell upon his other teammate. Even she was progressing, although not exactly in her skills at a ninja. She had finally become more comfortable around the two boys, and her stutter had all but disappeared. Of course, she still blushed up a storm whenever Naruto complimented her or got too close. Today, as he watched her go through her sets, he started to notice something was wrong. It was like her body was on autopilot as it moved from set to set. It just seemed too stiff. As he gazed at her face, he could tell that something was bothering her. Hinata's mind was indeed occupied. Her thoughts lingered on the conversation she had before she arrived at the training grounds. Earlier that morning, Hinata had made it abundantly clear she held no fondness for the bottom floor of the clan library. In fact, the only positive memory she could associate with the place was of the jutsu scroll her mother had left her. She hated the dark, cold feeling the room gave off, which seemed to mirror the main family that were its only visitors. That being said, she couldn't deny that the room was an incredible source of information. It was just that none of it was helping her right now. The previously dark room was now brightly lit, as new lanterns had been placed along the walls. Hinata sat at a desk in the corner of the room, consumed by a sea of scrolls. Ever since that day, when the scroll finally decided to reveal its contents, she had immersed herself in research. She had realized that this was something that was never going to go away until she dealt with it. So, she decided to take the initiative. Her father had given her full access to the clan's records, and she was making the most of it. She usually never worked on her project in the mornings. Normally, she reserved time for the scroll only after her daily missions and her own private training. Today, she had decided to come down to the floor because she believed she might have stumbled upon a breakthrough the night before. However, just as the others before it, her lead turned out to be another dead end. While her lead had initially held promise, records from multiple sources just didn't line up with the story in the scroll. She rubbed her eyes and looked at her clock. She decided she could read through it one more time before she had to meet up with her teammates. She picked up the scroll and began reading the fable she almost had memorized by this point. The Tale of the Rabbit Goddess, Part 1. It is believed that power corrupts, but absolute power corrupts absolutely. This is the tale of the Rabbit Goddess. How she came to be, came to love, came to fear, and came to hate. For love breeds sacrifice, which in turn breeds hatred. When we lose someone or something precious to us, hate is born. Vengeance is the product of that hate, and so death and pain follow. For millennia, pain spread across the world of man, bringing with it the ultimate byproduct of human nature: war. Wars for greed, wars for love, wars amongst enemies, wars amongst friends, wars amongst rivals, wars amongst brothers. It was a never-ending cycle that consumed the human consciousness. Then one day, a being clad in blinding light descended from the sky. Her skin was as white as ivory. Her eyes were as pale as the moon. This celestial maiden was revered and taken into the world of man. She was taken in and served the lord of the land she arrived in. This lord and the maiden made a connection during her service. However, this was not love. Love was a foreign concept to her. She had only one desire in this world. Her wish was for a world of peace devoid of fighting. Over time, rival nations grew jealous of the Lord and his mysterious mistress, and decided to lay claim to the land. However, a great spirit inhabited this land. In the center of the mountains stood the divine tree, whose branches towered above all. From this tree, a single fruit was born. This fruit was said to contain great power, but the tree's spirit would defend its power from any intruders. To end the fighting in her name, the maiden stormed the stronghold of the spirit and took the power of the fruit for her own. From the moment the fruit entered her mouth, their destinies were entwined. From that point forward, one could not exist without the other. Their energies merged, and with her newfound power, she laid waste to the armies of man. Thus began the reign of the Byakugan Queen, who was praised for her power and became a goddess to the people of the world. To maintain this power, she cut all her ties to the land she had previously known. This included her ties to the Lord with whom she had connected. Over time, the fruits of their connection emerged, and the rabbit goddess gave birth to 2 sons. These sons were also blessed with the power of the tree, and she finally learned to love. However, the seeds of mistrust had already been planted. The story abruptly cut off at this point, and it irritated her to no end. Hinata was someone who could not stand to leave a book unfinished. She felt she only had been given a glimpse into this story, and she wanted to know more. Who was this woman? How did she fall from grace? Hinata had never heard of such a title of a Byakugan Queen. She had combined through the piles of scrolls of the clan's history, looking for any hint towards the story. This morning, she had been following the lead of a Hyuga matriarch, who had used a similar moniker. However, her origins were well documented and did not align with the story. Hinata didn't know what to make of this whole thing. This absurd situation of ghosts, goddesses, and divine figures made her feel uncomfortable. While she wanted to dismiss the story as a fairy tale, she had the sinking suspicion that it was more than a precautionary tale. She had tried her best to figure out a connection between the characters in this story with the Hyuga ring, but she couldn't solve a puzzle if she didn't have all the pieces. It was all too much for a 12-year-old genin, who also had to focus on maintaining her training and completing missions. If she was ever going to solve this puzzle, she needed help. At the same time this was going on, this train of thought was shared with her father, as he sat face to face with Shikaku Nara. The head of intelligence, could not help but be surprised by the requested meeting. It wasn't every day that a Hyuga hierarch admitted that they needed help. While the prospect was certain to be troublesome, it had definitely proved interesting. "I'm sure your council would object to me in aiding you in this," he muttered as he cast a lazy eye over the symbols and hieroglyphs. "That's why I have neglected to inform them of our meeting. I can no longer pretend to act as if the Hyuga can solve this on our own. Generations have tried and gotten nowhere. The council has deadlocked. They seek progression, yet are unable to accept change." Shikaku nodded as he scrolled through the pages of the journals, his eyes absorbing the information off of the page. "I'll certainly take a crack at it. I have a cousin who works in the cryptology department. He's extremely passionate about this sort of thing. To be honest, if it weren't for pressure from his father, he'd probably be an archaeologist. Is it alright if I bring him in on this? If you believe that he will provide substantial help towards your progress, then by all means." After a few moments of silence, Shikaku looked Hiyashi in the eyes. How is Hinata responding to all of this? Hiyashi closed his eyes. Originally, not well. An incident like that would be traumatic for any child. It took a lot of coercion to get her to return to the bottom floor. However, she has lately been going down there more and more. Do you think she has made a breakthrough? I don't know, honestly. Hiyashi paused as he activated his Byakugan. The sight of the veins made Shikaku tense, as the Hyuga patriarch made sure that they were alone. "This is strictly to be kept between you and me. Do you understand?" Shikaku frowned but nodded. "I've begun to notice something rather odd." This was the head of the Hyuga clan, a clan renowned for its elegance, precision, and intellect. Odd was a very interesting choice of words. "Odd how?" he asked as he narrowed his eyes. "There have been moments when I have noticed large segments of time missing in my memory after talking with Hinata. To be honest, I didn't even realize it until one of my maids told me that I had been sitting in my office for 2 hours after a talk with her. It happens whenever she approaches me about something specific, but I can never seem to be able to remember what we discussed. Even when I have approached her about the topic, the same thing seems to happen." Shikaku's mind was racing. This was very concerning to hear from the head of one of Konoha's most prevalent clans. He was very careful with his next choice of words. "No offense, Hiyashi-sama. Are you certain that your daughter isn't placing you in a genjutsu?" "Absolutely. She may have the chakra control for a decent genjutsu user, but she has never been taught any outside of the ones taught at the academy. In any case, I made certain to activate my Byakugan active on one occasion before speaking with her, and it was still active after I finished. Besides, she isn't the type to keep big secrets. She is far too kind for her own good." Shikaku closed his eyes as his mind began to run through possibilities. She may not be the cause, but she definitely is the link. He rolled around an idea in his head. "She may not be the one directly doing it," he said slowly. Seeing the frown on Hiyashi's face, he continued. "From what you've told me about this monument of yours, this goes beyond the normal clan secrecy bull. Whatever Hinata-sama has gotten herself involved in, its discovery is certain to have a permanent effect on how the clan is seen and structured. This puts her in a position of extreme leverage. Someone may be trying to utilize this. Hinata-sama claimed to see a figure during her event in the library. While there obviously wasn't a ghost, there is a serious possibility there was another person in the room with her." Hiyashi's eyes narrowed. "Are you suggesting that this individual is the case for my gaps in my memory? What I'm suggesting is that there is a possibility of another party involved in this. For now, keep your eyes open for any shady activity with the clan. Especially keep a close eye on the council. They would be the only ones of clearance to that level." He began packing the supplies Hiyashi had given him into a storage seal and shook Hiyashi's hand. "Thank you for looking into this for me. I am very grateful. Don't mention it. Besides, I still owe your wife for a mission during the war. Before I go, I'd suggest having another talk with Hinata. If she really has made a breakthrough, she will need as much help as she can get. Try writing a letter to her beforehand in case you find yourself subjected to whatever is going on. With that, Shikaku left Hiyashi's office. As he headed for the front gate, he was surprised to run into the very topic of his last conversation. "Well, good morning, Hinata-sama," he said as he gave the girl a small bow. "Oh, Nada-sama," she said as she deeply bowed to the Jonin commander. "I had no idea you were here." He chuckled as he stared at the girl. "I had to attend to some business with your father regarding a personal project. I take it you're heading out to meet your team." "Yes, sir." "Well then, the Nara estate is in the same direction as the training grounds. Would you mind if I accompanied you?" "No, sir, not at all," she replied with a smile. With that, the two headed out of the gates and began walking towards the west side of the village. "How is Shikamaru? Is he adjusting to his new team?" the girl inquired. Shikaku sighed as he ran a hand through his hair. "The boy is even lazier than I had been at this age, but I can already tell he is going to be twice as sharp as I am. Concerning his teammates, he has been close with Choji and Ino for years. At this point, it's like throwing 3 siblings together on a team." Hinata giggled as she pictured Ino standing over the 2 boys. She could clearly see her barking orders as the 2 boys groaned and complained. "Speaking of teams, I'm very curious about yours," Shikaku said as he glanced down at the girl. "Really? Why is that?" she asked. "Your team is a special one. I don't know if you have any knowledge about the history of Team 7, but it's worth looking into. Every member who has been placed on that team has gone on to leave a permanent mark on the history of our village." This surprised Hinata. She had never thought about the previous incarnations of her team. "Could you name someone I would be familiar with?" "So you haven't told her yet, Hiyashi?" Shikaku thought, shaking his head. He continued. "Well, this was about 3 iterations back, but the Team 7 of old used to be led by the Saindame when he taught the legendary Sannin." Hinata's wide eyes were wide in shock. The Hokage had seemed to place her on a team whose legacy included the likes of the Sannin? He saw that kind of potential in her? And what did that say about her sensei? She had known he was skilled, but to that extent? "I hear the team is now made up of yourself, the last Uchiha, and that troublesome brat who painted our clan deer's horns bright orange," Shikaku said with a clear look of irritation. Hinata had to bite her tongue to contain a giggle. She had completely forgotten about that incident. Shikamaru had been angry with Naruto for a week after that, mostly because he had been the one forced to help clean it up. "Well, Sasuke is very reserved and doesn't like to talk to the rest of us very often. He is incredibly talented and certainly lives up to the reputation of his clan. His taijutsu is precise and he is very skilled in ninjutsu. However, he seems to carry a heavy burden upon his shoulders. I don't know what is causing him that pain, but we're hoping he will open up to us soon." Shikaku added, storing that for later. "And what about the Uzumaki? As much as that incident bugged me, I can respect the brat for actually managing to sneak into our property without being found. From what I hear, he's quite the Fuinjutsu expert." Hinata nodded and beamed. "Yes, sir. Naruto has proven to be very adept at the art of sealing. While his taijutsu certainly needs a little work, I'm certain he'll be able to fix it. His speed is incredible. I've never seen anyone our age move so fast." Shikaku looked down at her with one eye. "Is he using any sort of weight training? It's old-fashioned, but I've seen the results they can accomplish," he said as a vision of green spandex burst into his mind. "No, sir. I don't believe so. He might be receiving help from someone, but he hasn't told us yet. Although I don't know when he'd have the time. If he's not spending time on missions, he's always off in the woods reading and experimenting with new seals." Shikaku opened an eye and gazed down at her. "Now, how would you know what he is doing in his private time?" She tried to prevent the crimson hue from spreading across her face. Was she really that easy to read? And in front of a clan leader, no less. She knew this was Shikamaru's father, but still. Shikaku chuckled as the two continued their walk in awkward silence. Well, awkward for the embarrassed girl anyway. As they neared the west gates, it was time for them to part ways. I hope you and your team have a productive day, Hinata-sama. Thank you, Nara-sama, and I wish you success on whatever project you and my father are working on. Hinata replied with a bow. As she turned to leave, she stopped as an older man called out, Hinata-sama, a moment. She turned around to stare at the Nara hierarch. Gone was the jovial expression he had worn on their walk over. He was staring at her with a serious expression that she had only seen copied on Shikamaru's face once or twice. It's never a bad idea to look for help from others, especially when you're in over your head. Keeping secrets will only add to your stress and make things more difficult for you. If you have a problem stopping you from telling someone, take a step back and find a way around it. With that, he turned and left the white-haired girl shocked and speechless as she stood under the arch of the gate. He knew. To say she was shocked would be an understatement. There was only one way he could possibly know about her issue. It surprised her that her father was so dedicated to this problem that he would reveal such important secrets of the clan to an outsider. Could the monument be the project that Nara-sama had been referring to? In any case, he was right. Being unable to share any information about the scroll was starting to take a toll on her. She almost completely avoided contact with her father in case he thought she was going crazy. It was also time to start reaching out to others for help. She would renew her efforts to reach out to her father. Maybe it was time to try a simple solution. If something was preventing him from seeing the story in the scroll, then maybe he would see it on a different one. She made one final strike before raising her hands over her head and brought them down in the ending position. Thank you, Nara-sama. She turned around to see Sasuke staring intently at her face. He turned away quickly after they made eye contact. She was about to speak when a cloud of smoke erupted on the bridge, revealing the form of Kakashi. You're late, Baka-sensei! Naruto shouted. Kakashi bopped him on the head. Mind your manners, Naruto. Good news, team. There will be no training today. We have received a special mission from the Hokage just for us. It will be a nice change of pace to get out of the village for a while. All of his genin perked up with this and stared at him with wide eyes. Yatta! The blonde yelled as he bounced up and down. He grabbed Hinata's hands and started spinning in a circle. We got a C rank! We got a C rank! The blonde chanted as Hinata fought tooth and nail to stay conscious. I'm sorry to say it, Naruto, but it's not a C rank mission. Kakashi chuckled as he watched the pair's antics. Naruto instantly deflated and face planted on the ground. Sasuke didn't seem too pleased either. Hinata wobbled in place as she tried to regain her bearings. The mission is still a D rank, Kakashi said, which caused the two boys to groan. It's for a lumber business, less than a day's travel away from the village. But we're going out of the village. Doesn't that mean it's a C rank? What if we get jumped by bandits? While most missions outside of the village are generally C rank or above, that is not the case due to how close the outpost is from the village. Regarding any bandits, no bandit in their right mind would try anything so close to the village. We have scouting teams sweeping the area constantly, so no group of bandits could ever set up camp along the path. Sorry to disappoint you, Naruto. Kakashi said with an ice smile. Naruto pouted and grumbled as Hinata reached out and patted his shoulder. Sasuke pushed off the bridge and faced Kakashi. So why is this mission so special? Kakashi turned to him and pulled out the mission scroll. The Hokage personally asked us to take care of this job for one certain reason. Him. He said as he pointed the scroll at the blonde. Me? Naruto exclaimed in shock. Him? Sasuke echoed his surprise. Indeed, a fire broke out in the workers' quarters 2 nights ago. While many of the workers were injured in the fire, thankfully, no one was killed. The owner of the lumber yard has a very important order for a wealthy client in the village, and sadly, the client isn't a very patient person, so the order needs to be shipped out right away. He has asked us to help him with loading the lumber into the wagons and escorting it back to the village. He and the Hokage are old friends, so when he reached out, The old man gladly offered him a cheap D-rank mission with the perfect man for the job. "What makes me so perfect?" Naruto asked as he wrinkled up his face. "Simple. Your shadow clones and gravity seals. With your help, loading the carts will be much faster, as you can replace the workers who were injured and reduce the weight of the wood for everyone." Naruto stared at Kakashi before saying, "Hell, I can do you one better than that, Kakashi-sensei." "Why don't I just seal the lumber away in a storage seal? That way it's easier to transport, and it would reduce the time necessary for loading and travel." Kakashi rubbed his chin as he considered the idea. "That's not entirely out of the question. We would have to run it by the owner before we tried it." He turned his attention back to his other students. "Alright, team, since time is of the essence, we are moving out today. It's gonna be about an 8-hour hike from here to the town, so we should arrive around 7 p.m. if we leave on time. Pack for an overnight mission, and we'll meet at the front gates in 2 hours. Don't be late." With that, he disappeared in a swirl of leaves. Naruto looked excited. He rarely got to go outside of the village, and any chance to show off his Fuinjutsu skills was alright with him. He stormed off towards his apartment, shouting his goodbyes to his teammates as he ran off. This left the two clan heirs alone as they took a more leisurely pace back towards the village. "Are you excited for the mission, Sasuke?" Hinata asked, trying to make small talk. I'm not too thrilled by it, but it will at least be a nice change of pace." And that was all the boys said on the matter. They continued walking in silence for several minutes, until Sasuke surprised Hinata by asking, "Are you also irritated by Kakashi's lax teaching method?" She rolled the question around in her head, and chose her words carefully when she replied, "While I can agree with Kakashi-sensei's attitude towards the importance of teamwork, I can admit that I also would like something a little more challenging. While I am sure he is taking things at his own rate, it can be frustrating at times." Her answer seemed to satisfy him. "Good. When we come back from this mission, I want you and Naruto to back me up when I confront him." "What do you mean?" "I'm tired of not learning anything new. I want to learn some actual skills that don't revolve around teamwork. Working together is fine, but we aren't always going to be facing enemies together. When we get back, I'm going to make him change up our training schedule." Hinata paused before she asked, "And what if he says no?" Sasuke frowned as the gates came into view. "Then I'll just have to find someone else who is willing to teach me. You have your family to help you, and the dope has his stupid books. I'm not going to waste my time anymore." The resentment in his voice startled the Hyuga heiress. "I don't believe it will come to that. I think Kakashi-sensei will listen to us if we present our case to him. Besides, we're a team. Whatever we do from now on, we do together." Sasuke sent her a look that she didn't quite recognize before he curtly said goodbye and headed off towards the Uchiha district. As she headed back towards the Hyuga compound, her thoughts drifted back to the scroll that plagued her free time, and a headache started to form. A mission out of the village would certainly do good for everyone.